Welcome to Grow Smarter, brought to you by Tobe Marketing Media. As a founder, you know the pressure of making every marketing dollar count. My mission at Tobe Agency is to help healthcare and wellness entrepreneurs have more confidence, waste less, and grow smarter in their marketing media investments. So today we're going to talk about regenerative medicine, specifically stem cells, which is a hot topic in the healthcare, functional medicine, and wellness fields. Just a few things to note before we get the episode started today. Number one, the market is booming. The global regenerative medicine market is projected to reach an estimated value of $169 billion by 2034. North America holds the largest market share, and this demonstrates that regenerative medicine is a rapidly growing field that you might want to be paying to if you're a practitioner. Patient demand is high. Patients are actively seeking these treatments to alleviate pain, avoid, or delay surgery, or as an alternative to conventional medicine. And this is the key to today's episode, which is the problem of misinformation. There's widespread issue with exaggerated claims, quote unquote hype, and unproven therapies sold directly to customers. This is where a partnership with our guest and a company like Hyagen Medical and an agency like Tobe becomes essential for compliant and ethical marketing. So we're joined today by an extraordinary entrepreneur and expert, Chuck Meeker. As a co-founder of Hyagen Medical, Chuck is uniquely qualified to speak on this topic. He's not only a seasoned attorney, but he also holds a PhD in molecular biology and biochemistry from the University of Utah School of Medicine. His company, Hyagen Medical, works to help providers understand and talk about regenerative medicine in a meaningful and compliant way. Chuck has dedicated his career to demystifying the intersection of science, technology, and medicine with laws and regulations, particularly in the biotech community. He believes the conversation on regenerative medicine should be grounded in science and compliance, not hype, with the goal being to activate the body's natural healing abilities. We're honored to have him on the show today to provide a definitive blueprint for how to compliantly and effectively market regenerative medicine. So welcome to the show, Chuck. Great to have you here today.
Andrew, fantastic to be here. Thanks so much. What a kind introduction.
Yeah, no problem. I always find it interesting in the work that I'm in because I work with a lot of wellness practices, functional medicine practices. And we met at a fortuitous time for me, actually, because as I've been working with more of these functional medicine clinics over the last year or two, I have certainly seen this interest in providers wanting to provide stem cell therapy. And I'll be honest, I had no idea how to advise them on how to market it in a compliant way. And in fact, we typically do the thing is we don't touch it in terms of marketing, right? And so they're generally selling the treatments to their existing patients, but if they want to market it to new patients, there's a very tricky way to, there's a lot of compliance rules that you could potentially fall into. And in addition to that, with your existing patients, making claims and can also get you into a lot of trouble. So when we met, we met through a information session or a training that you were giving to a provider. And when I got your materials, I was just like, wow, this is literally the playbook to figuring out how to market this stuff in a really growing field. So tell me a little bit about Hyagen Medical, kind of the genesis of it. You're a co-founder. Tell me about your other partner that's involved in it and sort of what you guys do.
My other partner is the most important partner in my life. So Hyagen Medical is actually my wife's company. She has a passion for regenerative medicine, functional wellness. And when she and I saw this industry being resurrected, particularly here in the state of Utah, she wanted to be part of this. She said, I feel like we have something to offer to clinical providers who are spending day in and day out focusing on getting their patients well. But we didn't see a lot of efforts to support the practitioners and what they do. So we saw practitioners supporting patients, but nobody supporting practitioners. And so she said, we need to do this. I said, I don't have time for this. I've got a full-time law practice and clients that are counting on me. She said, I will start the company. I just need your support. And it was an interesting proposition, right? She had supported me through my PhD program and supported me through law school as we had raised our kids. And here she was saying, I want you to support me in starting this business. And I was just thrilled to do it. So um,
Amazing.
that's the genesis of Hyagen Medical. We focus entirely on providers, on clinical practitioners who want help doing things the right way so that we can move the needle for their patients.
Yeah, so for this episode, I kind of wanted to take more of a call it an elementary
Yeah.
education to a provider who, may have heard about stem cells on a podcast out there, right? Or maybe a patient came in asking about it, right? But let's just kind of start with a sort of baseline definition and this idea of autologous and allogeneic stem cell therapies. So for our audience, can you really break down the differences in these two approaches as a provider, why is it important to understand the differences in these stem cell therapies?
Yeah, very good question and great place to start. So you may or may not have heard the terms autologous and allogeneic stem cell therapy, but there's important distinctions. An autologous stem cell therapy is referring to the industry of deriving or extracting stem cells from a patient's own body. As grown adults, we have stem cell deposits, archives of our stem cells in our bone marrow and in our fat tissue and in other tissues in the body. And you can literally aspirate or harvest that tissue and then derive the stem cells out of it to be administered back into the same patient therapeutically. So this autologous stem cell industry rose on two, we'll call them facts for now. This industry rose on two pieces of information. Number one, the idea that your body's own stem cells are completely compatible with your body. So if you administer them to you, you don't have to worry about cellular rejection. We'll talk about the relevance of that as we go on with today's
Yep.
informational session, but that was one of the pieces of information. The other critical piece of information is that providers felt like other forms of stem cells were not legal. And so the only thing they could do legally was to take the patient's own stem cells and give them back to the patient. Well, as you dig into federal and state regulatory compliance, what you find is there are legal pathways for using birth tissue derived stem cells, other sources of stem cells, if you follow the guidance that's been given by the regulatory bodies. And going back to the first point, we find that the young stem cells from the birth tissue have a higher therapeutic capacity than the aged stem cells that are found in
Sure.
the patient's own body. So as far as superiority of technology is concerned, the evidence is pointing towards placental umbilical cord birth tissue derived stem cells for how superior they are.
Yeah, and this is potentially where some of the controversy sort of comes in with where those are sort of sourced, right? And we'll get into that in a second. But Hyagen Medical specifically focused on allogeneic products, right, derived from birth tissue. Why would you say? And again, like you just mentioned, it's about the age, and are there other reasons why that specific source of stem cells is superior? And what are the main advantages really for the provider and for the patient?
Sure. So I would say first and foremost, it's less invasive to the patient. We don't need
100%.
to
Yep.
go in and drill into the iliac crest or the hip bone. We don't need to aspirate out fat tissue. And so from a patient experience, it's better to receive a therapy rather than to have a therapy taken from you and then have to receive it.
Put back in, yeah. Mhm.
The therapeutic capacity of stem cells from your own body, when you think about the mechanism of action for these stem cells, which are administered therapeutically. And we'll talk more about, you've got to look at two different categories: the biological function of stem cells in the body as they exist naturally, and then the therapeutic function of stem cells when they're administered to a site other than where they're deposited. And I think there's a lot of confusion out there, a lot of hype, as you say, about what stem cells will do that doesn't match up with what the literature and the data are showing stem cells actually contribute to therapeutically.
Well, let's double click on that. So,
Yes, please.
like, let's draw this distinction, right, between what are stem cells and what do they actually do,
Sure.
right? There's a surface level kind of explanation. There's something that's much deeper here, and I think it ties back into kind of the regulatory framework and compliance framework, right?
Yeah, so actually, the surface level explanation is what causes most of the confusion in the industry. I'll bet that everybody listening to this episode has heard someone say stem cells are amazing because they have the capacity to grow into other cell types, differentiate into other cell and tissue types, so that you can use a stem cell to regrow tissue in an area of the body. If you have damaged muscle, stem cells can grow into muscle, and so on and so forth. It's not incorrect. It's just largely irrelevant to the field of therapeutic stem cell administration. And why I say that is because the notion of stem cell differentiation into different tissue types really has a foundation in embryonic growth and development, where a fertilized egg develops into a blastocyst that has a mass of embryonic stem cells, and those embryonic stem cells hold the source or the stem for all the different cell types and tissue types that are needed to grow a new human being. But here in the US, we're not harvesting embryonic stem cells from aborted fetuses. There are bioethical and there's safety issues associated with doing that. What we're talking about is after the baby is born, the birth tissues, the placenta and the umbilical cord, they contain vibrant bioactive molecular cells that have been termed stem cells. But they're not the stem cells produced by the growing fetus, the baby. They're the stem cells produced in the placenta, the command center for controlling the growth and development of a new human being. And those placental stem cells are characterized biochemically the same way that other stem cells in the body are characterized, by their cell surface markers and by their growth factor and cytokine contents. So the only way you can classify these are as stem cells because of how they look biochemically, but their function biologically is much different, is incredibly different from the differentiating stem cells that we find in an embryo. Rather than differentiating into different tissue types, placental stem cells, for example, the ones found in the umbilical cord blood that
Yep.
circulate through a growing fetus, a baby in utero, those stem cells are not little seeds that get planted in muscle and liver and bone and grow into new tissue. That's not how they function biologically. In
Yep.
fact, they're not even little construction workers that come in and repair damaged or injured areas. That's not what they do biologically. Biologically, what they do is they carry a large portfolio of biological human growth factors and cytokines that provide a signaling function in the growing baby's body. Specifically, these biomolecules will bind to cell surface receptors in the growing baby's body and activate molecular pathways associated with regenerative healing and growth and repair. It makes sense, right? Fetal growth and
Yep.
development is kind of a violent process. In the period of 9 months, you're growing a human being. And that involves tearing cells apart, and it creates inflammation and cellular debris. And there's not enough vasculature, blood vessels to feed the system. So it kind of just turns off, and you would get a spontaneous termination of pregnancy, but for the fact that the placenta is constantly sending these signaling molecule filled stem cells into the baby's system to turn those molecular pathways back on. So therapeutically, with the allogeneic stem cells, we harvest and purify these umbilical cord blood stem cells, for example, and we harness that power and use it therapeutically for the same purpose that they were being used biologically, to deliver those valuable, natural, biological human growth factors and cytokines in their entire portfolio, the whole entourage of these things. And wouldn't you know it, the body responds the same way therapeutically that it did biologically by turning on molecular pathways associated with regenerative growth, healing, and repair.
Yeah, I mean that's a such a nuanced sort of discussion, right? And I think it's like you talk a lot about the science behind it, right? And I think what this is getting to is, there's this key distinction between regenerative medicine, and that's a term that I think gets blanket used pretty often
Sure.
right now, right? And tissue engineering, right? Which there's a very, very distinct uh, definition to both of those things. So, obviously you're focused on regenerative medicine, right? And
Yes.
we're not growing tissue here. We're not growing things in a petri dish, right? We're not doing any of that kind of stuff. And
That is
you
a thriving industry,
sure,
right? There's a recent study out of the UK where they took stem cells and let's say they programmed them, right? They
yeah,
put different chemical compounds on them and they forced the stem cells down a differentiation pathway. Forced
mm.
them down that. They weren't originally going to go down that pathway, but in a lab, they started sending these stem cells down the pancreatic islet cell differentiation pathway. And they went down so far that these cells began to produce human insulin. And then
Oh,
they
fascinating, huh?
transplanted those cells into the pancreas of a type 1 diabetic
Yep,
and put
yep.
the patient on immunosuppressants to make sure that the stem cells didn't get
Wow.
rejected. And then
Yep.
those stem cells stayed in the pancreas and produced insulin, and the patient didn't need to take insulin shots. They had to stay on immunosuppressants for the
Sure.
course of the study,
Sure.
but they didn't need to take insulin shots anymore. That's the tissue engineering space. That's like
Yeah.
stem cell transplantation. We're not
Yep.
doing that. The stem cells that we use therapeutically, they don't stay around in the body. They don't get incorporated into your tissue and start growing someone else's cells in your body.
Right.
They're delivery trucks, right? They're
Yep.
cargo trucks, and they come and they
Yep.
drop off their natural growth factors and cytokines, and then their work is done. They just leave. The body takes care of that. The body identifies them as a cell that's not incorporated into tissue, and it just gets rid of it. But not before their like purpose has been accomplished, and that is to deliver the natural biological human growth factors and cytokines that bind cellular receptors and turn on pathways in the body. That's regenerative medicine.
So specific to Hyogen and how you source the stem cells, right? Can you tell us a little bit about sort of the supply chain, if you would, and how you get access to them and sort of your process for getting stem cells?
Sure. Our philosophy is that a stem cell is only as good as the birth tissue from which it's derived, and that the birth tissue is only as good as the mother in which it is grown. So we want to start with an ultra healthy population and then screen that population for healthy donor mothers. So
Hmm.
we've chosen to start in the state of Utah, which is known for individuals with an incredibly healthy lifestyle. No
Yep.
drinking, no smoking, no drug use, no tattoos, no communicable diseases, no
Yep.
multiple sexual partners. You get where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah.
So we
100%.
start with a general population that has an incredibly high level of health, and then we screen potential donor mothers, volunteer donor mothers who have
Yep.
consented to donating their birth tissue. And the way this happens typically is in an OBGYN office, a soon to be mother will read a piece of literature and say, I'd really be interested in donating my umbilical cord blood for
Yep.
research and therapeutic uses. And then they're put in touch with a birth tissue recovery company that is registered with the FDA and contracted with the local hospitals to be there at the time of labor and delivery. And once the baby and mother are fully taken care of and the doctor says you're good to go, then the birth tissue can be recovered. Okay, so the screening process, as you could imagine, with
Yep.
any blood or tissue derived product, there's a list of questionnaires for the patient. There's also family history questions, and then there's blood tests and tissue tests that are done. So we test the mother's blood before and after labor and delivery to make sure that there's no active infections or communicable diseases. We have them fill out a health questionnaire, a survey, there's no incentive to lie on the questionnaire for two reasons. Number one, you don't have to be qualified to donate. You're always going to get to donate.
Right.
Even if your birth tissue doesn't come into the Hyagen system because it doesn't qualify, it can still go to the university's regenerative research lab for research purposes. And then number two, there's
Yep.
no compensation given to mothers for donating tissue. That's not legal in the United States. It's a lot like an organ donor card on your driver's license. Out of the goodness
Yep.
of your heart, you want to donate. So once those tests come back, it's time for labor and delivery. We choose to use live, healthy cesarean birth tissue. And it's not because we
And why?
encourage C-section.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Yep.
because cesarean allows three things that are important to Hyagen. Number one, a completely sterile tissue collection environment. If we can control for sterility, we will, and we always do. So C-section is important for that. Number two is there's a lot less strain and stress put on the birth tissue in C-section recovery than in normal vaginal delivery. And if we can lower the stress and strain put on the
Sure.
birth tissue, we can enhance the
The
viability and the quality of the stem
viability.
cells
Yeah.
that are
Yeah.
in there,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And then number three, which is the most important to us, and that is if we know when the C-section is scheduled, we can have our processing lab prepared and sterilized to receive and process the birth tissue on the same day as labor and delivery. This is pretty unusual in the industry. Usually you'll have a birth tissue recovery hospital out of state from where the processing lab is, and they'll ship it overnight. Sometimes they'll freeze the birth tissue, but
Yep.
regardless, the time that it takes to get the birth tissue into the lab and processed, the freezing and thawing of the birth tissue puts stress and damage on those
Degrades the
cells.
quality of it, and
That's
yeah,
exactly
efficacy
right.
of it and
That's
everything.
right.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why, C-section is important to us. It also gives us the opportunity to swab the birth tissue and send it off for
Right.
testing to make sure there's no infectious materials in the birth tissue that was collected. And then, of course, once we're done processing the birth tissue in an FDA registered tissue processing lab, let's circle back to that in just a minute, by the way. Once that's
Sure.
done, then the products are sent out for independent third party testing because we want no bias in determining whether this product is free of contaminants, communicable diseases, infectious materials, anything like that. Only once we get back a clean certificate of analysis from an independent lab that says all of the samples you sent us are free of any harmful materials will we move the product from cryo quarantine into cryo distribution.
Okay. So then that's when, if provider orders it, it's been manufactured and you can ship it out
Correct.
basically. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so back to the registration.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
There are many ways for a laboratory to register with the FDA. For example, a lab could register as a blood bank and they have an
Mm,
FDA registration and they can receive and they can store umbilical cord blood as a blood bank. And they may go out and tell providers, we work with an FDA registered lab, but that registration is irrelevant to the production of a product. They don't
right.
have an FDA registration for processing and labeling and storing and distributing birth tissue derived products, human biological products. So it's important what registration you have because the FDA audits and inspects labs differently depending on what level of registration they're seeking. So if you're a blood bank, the level of inspection is very low. They come in and they say, do you know how to store blood properly so that it doesn't get contaminated? Yes. The level of inspection at a tissue processing lab, the audits that are done are more frequent and much higher. So you're given a level of uh, assurance that this
Yeah.
is not only a compliant lab, but that it's safe and it's using good manufacturing practices.
There's an interesting parallel that just kind of came to my mind, and we don't have to name, company names or anything like that, obviously, but um, peptides has been a very interesting field, over the last few years, right? And
Right?
there are a lot of peptide providers that are out there, and there's a lot of them that maybe are not up to snuff in terms of, the quality
Exactly.
of the manufacturing of them. And in fact, every time I go to these conferences and I meet, different vendors who are selling peptides or, hormones and things like that, it's very clear, like a lot of them, the high quality ones, their value proposition is that we have these FDA certs, we have these registrations with the FDA, right? And it's very clear that the providers who are interested in the quality, the efficacy of the product are asking about those things. And so is that is that sort of a similar situation that you sort of see here with stem cell therapy and sourcing stem cells in terms of compliance and all that kind of, and just being, not all stem cells are created equal, maybe is what I'm trying to get to.
Very, very true. Yeah, I like
Yeah.
that. Not all stem cells are created equally. In the peptide space, what we're plagued with here in the US is outsourcing your peptide product, right?
Yep.
Your peptide source out of the country. So
Yep.
you'll have peptides, right? The actual peptides brought in from out of the country, and then you'll
Compounded here. Yeah.
compound them here into a formulation and say, this is
Yep.
from a US pharmacy. So
Yep.
transparency is really key.
Yep.
If your providers, Andrew, are approached by a stem cell provider and you ask two basic questions, you'll get to the bottom of what you're looking for. Number one, can you show me your lab's FDA registration? Show it to me.
Yep.
They'll either tell you our lab is proprietary and they're not disclosed to the public because we don't want people circumventing us and going straight to the lab.
Hmm.
That's a joke. Nobody cares about you knowing the lab. The lab and the distributor can work together to make sure there's no circumvention. What they're trying to do is keep you from knowing that their lab doesn't have a registration certificate. So
Right.
you can ask them, can you at least tell me the name of your lab? And I will look it up online myself. There's a portal online at the FDA to look up.
Just like you would register on state business
That's
registration,
exactly
it's got to
right.
be up. It's public information.
That's
Yeah,
right.
sure.
If they won't tell you the name of their lab, it's a huge red flag.
Okay,
So
good to know.
registration,
Yeah.
okay? Number two, which is my favorite, is ask them if you're allowed to tour and inspect the lab for yourself. And most of them will say, oh no, what happens in the lab is totally proprietary and confidential. We can't expose our proprietary information and processes to the public. That again is a joke. 99% of what happens in the lab is industry standard. There's very few things, minor little
Hmm.
tweaks about the rate of temperature change and the specific reagents that are
Hmm.
being used, all of which can be, kept hidden and confidential, and you could still tour the lab. So at Hyagen Medical, those two things are always offered. You want to see our lab registration certificate? Sure, here it is. Here it is online. It's active and registered right now. Number two, you want
Yep.
to tour our lab, the lab that we contract with to derive birth tissue products? Absolutely. Come to Lehi, Utah. I'll take you there myself. You'll sit and meet with the lab director, ask any questions that you want. You can see the facility and where we process birth tissue. There's nothing to hide. And when there's nothing to hide, is when you know you're getting something that's on the up and up.
Yeah, 100%. And we have a mutual provider that we work with that's actually touring one of your facilities next week. She just told me yesterday. So yeah, Chuck definitely puts
You're
his money where
welcome
his
to,
mouth is
Andrew.
when it
You're
comes to that.
welcome
Yeah,
to.
I would love to
Come
see
do
it
it. Yeah.
actually.
Come
Yeah.
see the
I'm
lab.
just down the
It's great.
street. Yeah, yeah. I think it's I'll talk to her and I'll tag along actually. To check you guys out. We kind of touched on this topic, but I actually don't think we brought a true definition to it. And actually, I think as we're defining things and sort of going through terms and definitions, this idea of homologous use, right?
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, right. What does it mean, right? And why actually? And I think when I heard this term, when you gave the training session, I thought it might actually be one of the more important sort of concepts that, a practice owner might want to understand when they're thinking about offering these therapies. So what does homologous use actually mean, and why is it relevant to the discussion that we're having today?
Yeah, so the term homologous use comes from the FDA guidelines for authorizing compliant human cellular and tissue-based products, or HCTPs. Separate from the pharmaceutical drug pathway where you get an FDA approval, there is a 361 pathway for having human cellular and biological tissue-based products. not approved, authorized, compliant with
Authorized.
the FDA. Okay.
Yep.
So that they can be introduced into interstate commerce without being in violation of federal law. Because of the way they're processed and manufactured, they're deemed to have an ultra low risk of adverse reaction or safety concerns with the public. After
Right.
all, it's human cellular and tissue based products. So the term homologous use refers to the requirement that these 361 compliant HCTPs are intended for use therapeutically the same
Mm.
way that they were used biologically. And kind of where this came from was um, the effort to get cadaver heart valves and cornea to be fast tracked through and be compliant for use in a patient, right? So
Yeah.
the FDA said that's fine if you're using a heart valve as a heart valve, if you're using a cornea as a cornea, then that's homologous use. And that would be part of the compliance process. So now, how does that apply to umbilical cord blood derived stem
Yep.
cells? Well, you need to determine what is the biological function or use of stem cells and be able to market and
Right.
label and intend to use those homologously in their therapeutic application. So this comes full circle to back what we were saying at the beginning.
Yep.
Biologically, these cells are carrier vehicles for the natural biological human growth factors and cytokines. That's what they do.
Whether
They're
it's to a
mail trucks.
baby, whether it's to a baby, a fetus growing, right,
Yes,
or to a grown adult, right, that
that's
you're
right.
it's still doing, it's just carrying things. That's all it's doing. It's just carrying
Yeah.
the exosomes and cytokines, right?
So at the beginning, we talked about this being good science, good
Mhm.
understanding for what's really going on. But
Yep.
now we're talking about regulatory compliance. And it turns out that those two things are the same. Good
Yep.
science is what is compliant. So as you, as a practitioner, talk to your patient about therapeutic stem cells, when you say things like, stem cells grow into different tissue types and we can use it to repair tissues, it's biologically inaccurate. It's also dangerously non-compliant with federal
Right.
regulations. So we need to make sure we lock that up. When you talk about stem cells healing a damaged area of the body or reducing inflammation or anything like that, you're not just giving bad science, you're giving non-compliant medical claims about what stem
Right.
cells do.
It's the stuff that's inside the trucks, right?
Yeah, right.
And that counts, right? It's the stuff in, it's the Amazon packages inside the Amazon thing that actually do the healing. But when we talk about stem cells, an Amazon truck is an Amazon truck is an Amazon truck, whether it's a fetus receiving it or a grown adult, getting it through an injection or something like
Yeah, I
that,
tell
right?
you what, truth be told, it's not even what's inside the stem cell that matters.
Sure. Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
So the Amazon truck is great. The package carried in the Amazon truck is great. Inside the package, there is a recipe or an instruction to be
Right.
followed. But the
Yeah.
recipe doesn't do anything on its own. It takes a chef, right?
Yep.
So the body is the chef
The
that
chef. Yep.
follows the recipe that was delivered in a package that was driven by the mail truck. So who's the
Yeah.
hero in the story? The hero is the human. Our
Yep. It's the
body is
body. Yeah.
evolutionarily programmed to heal and regenerate itself. In fact, those growth factors and cytokines that are found in stem cells, they're already in our own bodies.
They live
That's
in us.
what
Yep.
we use, especially when we're young. When you sprain an ankle when you're young and it gets swollen, and 3 days later the swelling is down and you're back on the playground, your body is full of these regenerative molecules, and the pathways for regenerative healing are so active that you heal and recover very quickly. As we age, the
Yep.
content and concentration of those biomolecules decreases, the activity of your cellular molecular mechanisms gets turned down, and we call it aging. But it's just molecular deactivation. And if we can reactivate the molecular pathways, we get that same regenerative healing capacity. So what do? We deliver more of the bioactive molecules that we know are involved biologically in those
Yep.
pathways. And we use stem cells as the delivery vehicle for doing that.
Yep.
That is biologically accurate and it's incredibly compliant. If you'll stop, when someone asks, what does a stem cell do? Simply say, stem cells are nature's carriers. They're couriers. Stem cells carry and deliver natural biological human growth factors and cytokines. That's what they do. Full stop. Now,
Yep.
those biomolecules, those growth factors and cytokines, they have a biological counterpart in your own body. And our body uses its growth factors and cytokines as molecular signaling molecules to turn on pathways associated with regenerative repair. So why are we delivering the stem cells to you? Because they contain the same molecules that our body needs.
Yep.
That's
And
compliant
it's
language.
homologous use, right? And
Correct.
we're not using it for its original sort of intended purpose,
Right.
right? It's not anything different than that,
Yeah.
right? Um, yeah, go ahead, Chuck. Yeah.
So homologous use is one of the federal regulatory requirements. There's another huge one, and that is minimal manipulation. You'll hear this term a lot in the industry as
Sure.
well. One of the other federal guidelines is that the product be minimally manipulated from its biological source to its therapeutic product form, right?
Hmm.
So, for example, if you're altering the structure or the form, if you're, you know, expanding or growing these stem cells out so that they're not natural stem cells, they're semi-synthetic laboratory grown stem
Right.
cells, the FDA could come in and say, well, that's not minimally
That's a gray
manipulated.
area, right?
Right.
It's like how much has it been altered,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah.
So for
Yeah.
Hyagen Medical, we obviate this issue. We say
Yep.
these are the first generation natural umbilical cord blood derived stem cells. They are the actual cells that have not been manipulated. The only thing that we've done is remove the blood components found in the umbilical cord blood. But these aren't the so the umbilical cord blood derived stem cells are not blood components. They're placental stem cells. They just happen to be
Right.
found
Tissue.
in the blood. So you can remove the red blood cells and all the other donor cell components and be left with a purified, isolated stem cell population that hasn't been manipulated at all in any way. It's just had everything else removed to get down to that product. And that's how we ensure federal regulatory compliance. Other companies, other labs will take the stem cells and then they'll grow them in culture so that instead of 10 million stem cells, they have 20 or 50 or 100 million stem cells.
Oh,
Sometimes you'll even
interesting.
see
Huh.
people going to Mexico to get 100 million stem cells because cellular expansion is legal in Mexico and not in the US. Here in the US, if
Interesting.
you have a provider telling you they're going to give you lab grown or lab expanded stem cells, it's a huge red flag. You're not administering a compliant product. Biologically, it's also important to note there's very little evidence to support that expanded stem cell populations contain the same portfolio of growth factors and
Interesting.
cytokines that were found in the natural first generation stem cells. So, number one, they've been more than minimally manipulated. Number two, they may not have the same therapeutic capacity. The number of
Yeah.
cells doesn't matter.
It's like eating sockeye salmon, wild salmon versus farm raised salmon, right? You don't get all the omega 3s and all that kind of stuff from,
But at least
the
that
farm
they've
raised.
tested,
Yeah,
right?
right,
when you
right,
when you
right.
come into this industry, everyone wants to tout the number of cells in their product. And at Hyagen, we say, what does that matter? The stem cell is not a
Yeah,
therapeutic entity. The stem cell doesn't do anything. It's just a carrier vehicle. What matters is the content and
correct.
concentration of growth factors and cytokines inside of it. So we would love it if everybody would do a bioassay, an immunoassay to do a count of the natural growth factor and cytokine protein content. We do it. We have that data that we can show you, done by an independent third-party lab. But in order to compare products apples to apples, we rely on others to follow suit and do the same thing. And nobody's doing that. They're all stuck on the idea of cell count matters. But it really doesn't.
Mm,
Cell count is a surrogate for the number of growth factors and cytokines. Unless you standardize that, it's almost meaningless.
gotcha. good marketing, right?
Yeah, great. No, great
or
marketing.
bad marketing at that,
Yeah,
or
I guess
non-compliant too, right?
it depends on what side. Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point. If you're marketing the number of cells you have and saying
Yeah,
that's the turning point, then you're inherently saying that the cell matters, that it's a therapeutic entity. And that's not homologous use. We're not using the cell for its cellular ability. We're using the cell for its carrier ability. So we don't like to
right.
cross that line. We think it's confusing biologically and therapeutically. And we think it's risky from a compliance and legal standpoint.
Yeah, totally. And so, if you're a provider out there, maybe thinking about, you know, offering stem cell therapy, all these distinctions that Chuck is sort of drawing here and how they're sourced, right? It can have a lot of implications for sort of where you lie in terms of compliance by even using, right, potentially non-compliant. And Chuck, I can't remember where I saw this, so don't quote me on this number. But as I was researching this episode, um, I think I saw that there were about 700 like unauthorized like stem cell
Oh, wow.
providers that are out there in the United States, and I was shocked at that. Yeah, you're surprised at that number too. I don't know where that I have to go look at the source and I'll look it up. But when I put the show notes together, but yeah, I think that can have a lot of implications for the quality of care that you potentially delivered. Because Chuck, you mentioned that even that there might be some issues with efficacy, right, with some of these other types of stem cell providers, but also there's still a lot of gray area out there, and you potentially run from just sourcing the wrong stem cell company, like you can be not in compliance from day one. And I think what you've thought about is, how do I build a supply chain that eliminates all of this, and the provider never has to worry about this, because from day one and from the very source, homologous use, right, where all of that, like we are compliant with these things. And I'm guessing that's a big reason potentially why you sort of built the ethos or the value proposition around Hyagen around this, because there's a lot of compliance in your messaging when I go to your website, but that's not something that every other stem cell provider or company has, right? So,
Yeah, you
um,
you bring up a lot of good sorry, you bring up a lot of good points in that statement right there. So the concept of providers not having to worry because the product is sourced properly is found in the federal regulatory guidelines.
Hmm.
So the 361 compliant HCTP products, the requirements for those ends at the distribution.
Okay.
So this all matters from an FDA compliance standpoint, how the tissue is sourced, transported, processed, labeled, stored, and distributed.
Yep.
There is a specific line in the regulatory guidelines that says if you are only receiving a 361 product for the
Uh-huh.
purpose of administration within your facility, these requirements do not apply to you. In other words, clinical practitioners do not have any additional regulatory burden placed on them from the federal government as long as they're receiving compliant 361 HCTPs. So now it's critical for you as a provider to know that you're receiving the product, because then the only thing you have to worry about is your state professional licensing scope of practice requirements. And you know that better than anybody, right? We can
Yep.
talk about it as we discuss and
Yep.
train with you, but it's so nice knowing I've received an FDA compliant product. Now, what you have to worry about is not screwing it up once you get it. And how a provider
Yep.
screws it up is by marketing their product in a non-compliant way. Everything we've done to build a compliant supply chain goes out the window the first time a provider says, we're going to administer stem cell therapy to heal your injured shoulder and help you avoid surgery. It all goes out the window every time you say, these stem cells will reduce inflammation systemically in your body. So your
Right.
words matter. And so Hyagen loves to come in and sit down and have an in-service to train you and your staff and your providers and your
Yep.
marketing director and your website folks.
Yeah, that's where we met because I
Exactly.
was doing marketing for a provider that was interested in doing stem cell therapy. They connected with you. I had no idea who you were. They asked me, "Hey, there's this guy. He's going to talk about marketing stem cells." I'm like, this is interesting. I'm gonna show up at Friday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right, to go to listen to this listen to him give a spiel. So you talked a lot about what you talked about today, which is why I wanted to bring you on here because I just thought that was just a very succinct way of explaining things to and the audience there was not just NPs, right? It was the owner
Oh
themselves
yeah.
who does more of the aesthetics type of stuff, right? And so there's a lot of folks who they may not be administering the therapy, but they might work in right the practice itself, and they actually need to hear what you're saying because you don't want your front desk person making those claims either. You know what I mean?
Bingo. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's why we gather the whole clinic together.
100%.
And we
I
make
thought it
sure
was brilliant. Yeah.
everyone is on board with the same talk track.
Yeah.
Because when a patient walks up to the desk and says, I hear you guys do stem cell therapy, is that going to be right for me? They don't want to hear, well, let me let you get an appointment with the provider and they can tell you. They want something satisfying right here, right now. And so if we can help them develop and incorporate a very small compliant talk track that anybody can deliver, even at the front desk in a moment, now you're able to give patients what they're looking for. And that talk track
Yep.
comes from what we've been talking about today, a biological foundation for legal and regulatory compliance in your practice.
So let's just use some examples and when I put the show notes together and we publish this episode, I'll include the mark you had some outstanding handouts when you gave your training. And one of the handouts was this sort of like don't say this, say this,
Yeah,
right? And you kind of talked about like celebrities or the different angle, all the kind of like trying ways to reframe some of those hype statements into more
sure.
compliant sort of marketing language. So can you give me just a couple examples of like, hey, a lot of people say this, say it this way instead.
Yeah. So when you're going out into the world electronically, your main goal is to get attention, to get some interest, right? To pique someone's interest. And a lot of times you can do that just by appealing to celebrity value. So
Yep.
saying something like Kobe Bryant had to travel to Germany to get stem cell therapy. You can get stem cell therapy in the US now. Come ask us whether stem cell therapy is right for you.
Yep.
Doesn't make any claim about what stem cells do. There's no problem there. And I guess we should stop for just a second, Andrew, and correct a misconception.
Sure.
There
Yeah.
is there is no federal guideline or requirement or restriction on using the term stem cell or exosome or regenerative medicine in your marketing material. Everyone got so confused about improper stem cell marketing that they made the word stem cell the boogeyman.
Yep. Exactly. That was me for sure. Yep. 100%. Yep.
So the problem is not saying stem cells. The problem is tying stem cells to an outcome or tying stem cells to a disease that's being treated or saying that the stem cells affect the structure or function of the body. That's not what they do. It's biologically inaccurate and it's non-compliant regulatorily. So let's
Yep.
stick to what's true. Stem cells are nature's carriers. They deliver natural biological human growth factors and cytokines. We know scientifically from the published literature that those same growth factors and cytokines are what our body uses naturally to turn on regenerative growth pathways, like the pathways that control inflammation in our body, and the pathways that reduce cellular debris and scar tissue, the pathways that form new vasculature, the angiogenic pathways, and the pathways that activate cellular growth and repair for wound healing and cellular migration. Those are the natural pathways in our body that our body uses growth factors and cytokines to turn on. We're using stem cells to deliver more growth factors and cytokines. The complete portfolio of growth factors and cytokines found in the original stem cells in the placenta. That's all. That's compliance. We're
Yeah,
not saying what the stem cells will do. We're not even saying
exactly.
what the growth factors and cytokines will do.
Yep.
We're certainly not saying that we're going to affect the structure or function of the body or treat a disease or provide an outcome. We're using science to help the patient understand what stem cells deliver and what those delivered molecules are known to do biologically in the body so that their body becomes the hero in the story. It's much more satisfying for a patient to hear your body holds the key to regenerative growth and repair.
And actually, you put a really interesting distinction when we were in our training session, and I think you noted that it's almost like if your baseline health is not that great, right? Like the stem cells may not be able to do much for you, right? Because your body's existing natural kind of healing abilities are maybe diminished, right?
Yeah, let me
And
clarify that. The stem
yeah,
cells
please,
will always do what the stem cells are designed to do. The stem
which
cells
is
will
the
always
truck. Yeah,
deliver the growth
they'll
factors
get
and
there.
cytokines.
Yep.
The question is whether your body's molecular pathways and your body's cellular receptors are intact and functional and prepared to receive a signal. If those
Right.
pathways are just turned down, but they're still
Hmm.
active and available to be turned up, that's when stem cell therapy has been shown to give amazing outcomes for people. Because as you increase the concentration of growth factors and cytokines in the body, you get more binding activity. And we
Yeah,
know that
gotcha.
more binding activity leads to activation of cellular pathways. And cellular pathway activation leads to biological responses that are therapeutically beneficial. So the stem cells will always do what they're supposed to do because we've ensured that the product is a quality product.
Right.
What you might not get is the response you're looking for because your body has damaged pathways.
Right.
So this is where a holistic approach to medicine is critically important. It's not just about can I get stem cell therapy as a cure-all. It's about
Right.
making sure that your body is prepared to receive and to maintain the molecular activation that takes place upon binding of growth factors and cytokines to your cellular.
And that's where your partnership with your provider really comes into
Yes,
play, right? They,
that's
and
right.
and actually, I wanted to ask you, the providers that you started working with, can you just kind of give me like a profile of them? Like
Oh my gosh.
what did they start as, or are they just pure like wellness clinics? They've got NPs in them. Did they start as aesthetics and they started adding on, NPs and wellness services, right? Like what is the kind of, or if there's multiple personas or types of practices that you work with, I'd love to hear where the types of practices that you come across that are working with you.
So the very first two clinics that ever carried our product here in Utah, one was a board certified orthopedic surgeon, and
Oh, really?
the other was a prolific chiropractic trained functional health and
Okay.
athletic
Okay.
sort of
Chiropractic trained, but it
time
was in the
for it.
functional health space. Yeah,
Right. So
sure. Yeah.
these aren't med spas and functionally integrative
Yep.
so much as they are people trying to support physical activity. So
Totally.
the orthopedic surgeon said, look, I'll cut to find a cure when I have to, right? I'll go in for surgery when I have to. But if someone is a candidate for regenerative growth and repair of their own problems, why not do that? Probably the thing he was more interested in is after surgery, I'd like to see my patients recover quickly and have better
Oh,
outcomes. So
yeah.
he incorporated
Totally.
stem cell therapy post surgery in order to help
Yeah.
his patients get back and regenerate their functionality even faster. And he's seen
Now, it's
amazing.
funny you mentioned that. My wife, my mother-in-law, she had a bad just accident spill, and like she broke her leg, right? But it could have been a lot worse, right? But just she's just an active person. She works and is on her feet a lot, and she was actually asking about, hey, is this going to help me? Could this potentially help me recover more or recover faster, right? And I told her like, hey, look, there's use cases where it potentially has, and so that, and again, like I think, seeing those kind of treatments. So with orthopedic surgeons, rehab, right? Like getting back to rest recovery, basically.
Yeah.
That's like one sort of big use case that you've seen. Cool.
Yep.
What
And
other types of practices? Yeah.
so we've got a lot of med spa geared wellness clinics.
Yep. Hmm.
So this is
Yep.
not surprising, right? They're more of the
Yeah.
non-traditional approach to health and wellness.
Yep.
They look at hormone optimization. They look at peptide
Exactly.
use. So stem cells fits neatly within that category. We do have podiatry. We
Oh
have
yeah, sure.
spine and sport. We have pain management.
Yep.
Um, I mean, so it really runs the gamut. We
Yeah.
have plastic surgery offices, hair restoration and
Sure.
transplantation
Hair
offices.
restoration. Yep.
So, and
Yep.
you imagine a mommy makeover surgery, right?
Yep.
There's this massive scar coming across the abdomen, and we
Yep.
have surgeons using stem cell therapy to help the body activate its natural processes for reducing and eliminating cellular debris in scar tissue and forming new
Inflammation.
vasculature to feed the area, reducing
Yeah.
inflammation, redness, and swelling, and spurring on growth to heal an area, cellular growth and repair. It's a perfect use case for post-surgical applications, whether cosmetic or functional orthopedic.
Are there specific geographies that you're working with right now, or are you focused here just in Utah, or are you kind of working with practices or providers sort of across the nation right now?
Yeah, we're starting out in the West,
Yeah.
but we do have one or more clinics further east.
Cool.
So
Cool.
so we'll ship anywhere in the United States. Again, the federal regulatory guidelines are that a 361 compliant HCTP product can enter interstate commerce. So
It
the people
can.
yeah, they can. So the people that
Okay.
stay within their state are the ones that need to make some kind of argument that the FDA doesn't have regulatory authority over them because it's not leaving their state. I don't think there's a lot of sound legal principles involved in that argument, but I also think it shouldn't matter. You should work
Right.
with a group that has looked at the federal regulatory guidelines and said, I know how to comply with those. And then they've spent the time and, to be honest, the money to put together a supply chain system and a laboratory
Yep.
equipped with compliant, validated equipment and been audited and registered and they
No,
comply
it's
with it.
wild. I mean, you mentioned kind of the aesthetics practices that are geared towards wellness, and they do the hormone optimization. It's been a let's just say it's been a really interesting marketplace there because of it's just it's certainly a gray area in healthcare, I feel like right now. And as you mentioned, every state's got different regulations, and as a
Yeah.
provider, your states. In Utah, there's been specific legislation that's been passed that actually calls out some of these things to make sure that the provider is not necessarily encouraged, but has some cover to say that they can do these things, right, from a state regulatory standpoint. But maybe you can double click on that a little bit and maybe talk to Utah's specific situation when it comes to legislation around this.
Yeah. So Utah received a lot of input from providers who expressed a concern that by administering non-FDA approved therapies, that somehow they would be violating their professional licensing. And so the state of Utah responded. And last year in May of 2024, they passed a law that said a healthcare provider in the state of Utah whose scope of practice includes the use of stem cell therapy may perform a stem cell therapy that is not FDA approved. So this doesn't authorize
Yeah, you to make bad statements,
healthcare
right? Yeah.
providers to do something that's non-compliant. It
Yes.
just says the state professional licensing board is not going to fine you or revoke your license for using a
if you
non-approved FDA product. But we don't like
but if they buy
we
from
already
you,
knew. That's right.
yeah,
We
yeah.
already knew that you could perform non-approved therapies.
Correct.
We're
Yeah.
doing compliant therapies,
Yep.
361 HCTP products. So mostly it was just a comfort blanket for practitioners in Utah who said, I really want to
Yeah.
do this, but I'm worried. They came out and said, don't worry, you're in the right in doing this. But you still need to comply with federal regulations. It's not
Through
like a
through
free for all.
distribution,
That's
right?
right.
Through
Yeah,
distribution,
that's
and
right.
then when you see the patient, definitely don't be making any of those statements that we just gave
Yep.
examples of, right?
Yep. Very good.
Um, no, Chuck, this was a great lot of information in here, and we'll have a lot of information to parse out and share with our audience. Chuck has Hyagen Medical has got some really good marketing materials that I think every provider that is offering stem cell therapy can probably benefit from, whether you're buying from them or not. And if you are offering stem cell therapy, definitely ask for that lab certificate, right? And
The
how it's
tour,
manufactured.
tour of the
Exactly. Get
lab.
the
Yeah.
tour. And if they do give you the no, there's all these secrets and, smoke and mirrors kind of thing, like Chuck said, that's most likely a red flag. So, Chuck, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. If you're interested in working with Hyagen Medical and Chuck and his team, you can go to their website at hyagenmedical.com. Reach out. There's a contact form on there if you're interested in working with them as a provider. And if you do, you'll get the awesome training that Chuck provided to the mutual sort of client that we had here in Utah. So, Chuck, thanks so much for coming on today. I really appreciate your knowledge, and we'll have to do another episode, and maybe we'll take another like a case study sort of slant to it or
Yeah, I'd
something like
love that.
that, right? Yeah, yeah,
I'll say if you're listening to this episode and you're not ready to implement stem cell therapy in your practice, but you still want to learn more, please visit hyagenmedical.com, HYAGEN medical.com. Fill out that form. This is not just for people who want to onboard and start receiving our products and training. It's for anyone in the community that would like some of the information that we put together about the biological mechanism of action and legal and regulatory compliance and product supply chain and best practices. We're really here to help where we can. If you're married to your current stem cell provider, that doesn't mean you shouldn't talk with us. Let us help you where we can.
100%. Yeah, no, I think I was initially I think I hit it off with you guys because I love the idea of just connecting with people through education, right? You may not buy anything from me, but if you learned something useful, like I did my job. And I think when in a world where there continues to be a lot of gray area and people operating in these gray areas, it's nice for someone to come out there and just be, and again, with a lawyer background as well, I think that's a big value proposition, is to just basically very clearly define, like, say this, don't say this. Here's the blueprint. Here's the playbook. So
Yeah, by doing that, we make sure that the industry stays vibrant because we watched a
yes.
couple of bad apples ruin the industry in 2018 to 2020. And it's
Yep.
only recently that it's been resurrected with a
Yep.
few groups doing it the right way. So Hyagen Medical is really here to make sure the industry can stay vibrant, and we're here to help providers in any way we can.
Awesome. Chuck, thanks so much for joining us. It was great to have you. Thank you. And we'll talk to you soon. Okay.
Thanks again. Great to be here. Look forward to chatting again soon.